When the world is just too much, turn it off and turn on positive, encouraging K-Love.
I'm gonna praise.
World off. K-Love on.
K-Love is sunshine for my soul.
I love K-Love.
Listen now on your radio, online, or on the free K-Love app.
K-Love makes me feel so good.
Positive, encouraging K-Love.
Thank you for listening to The History of the Papacy. I am your host, Steve, and we are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, including Scott Rank's History Unplugged, James Early's Key Battles of American History, and Richard Lim's This American President. Go to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. Quickly, I'd like to mention Patreon. We're back on Patreon at patreon.com/history of the papacy. We have 4 great tiers: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. And there's so many benefits to joining. The big one is that you will be included on the History of the Papacy diptychs, which in traditional Christianity is the list of bishops ranked in order. So if you want to be higher on the list, you've got to sign up quicker. And I really, really would appreciate your help. I know in this holiday season, it's kind of tough. Times are tough all around, but your support on Patreon goes a long, long, long way to keeping this whole operation going. And I would just really appreciate it if you did consider joining on Patreon. And I would like to thank and welcome our latest Patreon, Elliot, at the Alexandria level. Thank you so much for your support, Elliot, and to everyone who listens, leaves reviews on Apple Podcasts and everything else. I just really very much appreciate it. Now let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have Roberto, Joran, William, Brian, Jeffrey, Christina, John, and Sarah at the Alexandria level. Doppo, Paul, Justin, and Lana, all of whom are magnificent at Constantinople. And reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome, we have Peter the Great. Martyrs and martyrdom in the Christian context is a fascinating and controversial topic. Scholars have debated the historicity, truthfulness, and accuracy of early accounts of Christian martyrs. Some scholars claim much of the martyrdom of accounts are, at a minimum, false. New scholarship is painting these accounts in a more complex light. We are joined again by Professor David L. Eastman, author of many books and articles on the early church, particularly a book I really enjoyed on North African Christianity. So you can go back and listen to those episodes. They were really great when we talked about his book and North African Christianity, but today our focus is martyrdom, and Professor Eastman will guide us through a discussion of new and old ways to view ancient martyrs and the early persecutions in Christianity. With that, here is the next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Welcome back. I am very happy to be joined again by Professor David L. Eastman today to discuss the idea of martyrdom in early Christianity. Professor Eastman is the author of Early North African Christianity, Turning Points in the Development of the Church. And in a previous episode, actually 2 episodes, we discussed that book and the North African Church. So I highly suggest people go back and listen to those. But Professor Eastman is the Joseph Glenn Sherrill Chair of Bible at the Macaulay School. He's an adjunct professor at the University of Regensburg, Germany, and a fellow at the Center of Early African Christianity. He's also the author of numerous books and articles and has a PhD from Yale University. Thank you so much again for coming on to talk about this, these fascinating topics.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. It's always good to talk about dead people.
Yes, exactly.
At least in my world.
Now, what do we know about, in the very broad strokes, what do we know about martyrdom in the early church?
Well, it's actually one of these topics about which we know a fair amount, At the same time, that statement immediately begins the conflict and the controversy surrounding this. So there's no question that the accounts of the martyrs were very popular among early Christians. So we have a lot of them, and we have a lot of them preserved in a manuscript tradition through the Middle Ages, which tells us that they were popular through the Middle Ages as well. Here's kind of where the controversy begins, because historically, there have always been concerns about some of these martyrdom accounts, particularly the ones that are written, let's say, several hundred years after the events. So to kind of dive right into it, a key point is the Constantinian period. And so you have a number of martyrdom accounts describing events that happened before Constantine. But what do you do with martyrdom accounts written in the 4th or 5th century that claim to be about the 2nd or 3rd century? Those have always been a kind of an area of some controversy. And that's probably where, as an historian, we have to be honest, we're on much less solid ground than we might be with especially 2nd and 3rd century texts describing 2nd and 3rd century events. So in terms of martyrdom, there are a lot of martyrdom accounts out there, and immediately we can begin to kind of put them in categories as accounts that are more closely written in the time of the events, and other accounts that are maybe written much later about earlier events.
What are the big problems of an account written many years later, as opposed, there's the obvious ones of an account that's written closer is usually better, but are there any accounts that were written later that maybe the people had an access to material that could have given them more of a view on those events than what we might say that, just write them off, they were 100 years later, how could they know?
Right. That's a possibility. What seems to happen with some of these later accounts is maybe not access to more information, but a need to justify things that were happening in the later period with earlier accounts. And that's where with some of these accounts we get into some difficulties. Let's say there's a church in Rome venerating a certain martyr. Well, where does that martyr come from? Let's say for example, Saint Sebastian, a famous martyr in Rome in late antiquity. And you have a church, San Sebastiano, which rests over top of one of the earliest veneration sites for Peter and Paul in Rome. So it's a very interesting site. The account of Sebastian's death is supposed to be a 3rd century event written in the 5th century. So what you have is lively 4th and 5th century veneration of Sebastian in Rome, but no story to explain it. And then sometimes you later have an author going back and writing that story. And that's where it gets trickier. Especially when you get into historical questions, that's where it gets extremely tricky. So that's what we're kind of dealing with different kinds of evidence about martyrdom. Is it possible that they later came up with more information? That's possible. One of the things that I've argued in the accounts of Peter and Paul is that as we trace them over time, we can actually see different points of emphasis in the story. And often those different points of emphasis tell us more about what's happening at the time those texts were written than maybe about the 1st century. So the retelling of Peter and Paul's deaths in the 4th century are addressing some 4th century issues that we know were 4th century issues, but not 1st century issues. So really what they're doing is they're telling the story in their own context and trying to answer their own questions, which is kind of what we do. And the fancy name for this, we call this memory studies or collective memory or social memory. It's the idea that when we recount historical events, we're always thinking about the lenses that we have, the questions that we are asking. And sometimes that will cause us to tell events in a certain way in one context, in a different way in another context. Did the event still happen? Yes, the event may still have happened, but the way we tell it may be different based upon our circumstances. And so with scholars, if we're dealing with ancient literature like this, and in some cases archaeology and liturgy and sermons, we have to try to kind of reverse engineer and see what of this story is the 4th century concerns and what of this story is maybe a 2nd or a 1st century layer. That's part of the complexity of dealing with some of these texts, and which has led some people to go to, in my opinion, to an extreme of kind of a dismissive deconstructionist approach to all these texts. And I think that's where we get into methodological problems, treating them all as if they're all the same kinds of texts.
I think that gets really to the heart of the issue that we're getting to today is these martyrdom accounts that oftentimes they're not strictly historical, but they had a meaning to the people who wrote them at the time. In the early church, what was a martyr? Yeah,
so the word martyr comes from a Greek word that simply means witness. The word martys means witness. It's the word that you would use for someone who is giving testimony in a court. And it seems to be Christian usage, and perhaps it may actually be Revelation itself, where the Greek word martys takes on the more technical definition of someone who died on behalf of their faith, or someone who died for their faith. So that's what the word really comes to mean. The martyrs are those, not just those who die as Christians, but who die because they are Christian. And in many of the accounts, there's this testing, and there's an opportunity for them to recant or to offer a pinch of incense in honor of the emperor in order to save their lives, and they refuse to do it. And so as a result, they're imprisoned, in many cases killed. And so they're put into kind of a different category, the martyrs. And as such, Christians come to believe that they have a kind of a special place in God's economy, a special place in the cosmos, and they're humans, but they're in some ways, they have special ability to advocate on your behalf with God. And so we have a lot of prayers to Peter and Paul and other martyrs saying, please help me, pray for me, remember me, save me. This kind of language that shows up in the early church, where you're appealing to martyrs because the way they died was proof of their faith. And that becomes kind of a special category. And you have the subcategory, which are living martyrs, often called confessors. And these are people who refuse to renounce their faith and are put in prison and perhaps tortured, but don't actually die. But they're still considered, in a way, living martyrs because they have done everything the martyr is asked to do. They have confessed their faith, stuck to their faith, even in the threat of violence or death.
Is this idea of martyrdom, is this something that was unique or an innovation to Christianity, or does it have any corollaries in Greek, Roman, or Second Temple Judaism?
Yeah, so scholars often talk about kind of Greek and Roman noble death traditions. And so someone like Socrates would fit in this category. Socrates, who according to Plato's account was not guilty really of anything, but died a noble death, a death on behalf of his ideas. And then in the Jewish tradition, you really have a much more direct connection with the story of the Maccabees brothers. This is a story that in the Maccabees texts, which are part of the Apocrypha, the period of time between the Old Testament and the New Testament. These are texts that are in the Roman Catholic Bible, but not in the Protestant Bible. You have the accounts of these brothers who are threatened if they don't basically violate Jewish laws. They refuse, and there are 7 brothers who are killed. A priest is killed. Their mother eventually dies of grief at the loss of these 7 brothers. And the Maccabees become, in many ways, models for early Christian martyr stories. So the Maccabees are in the background. Of course, Jesus becomes an important model for faithfulness unto death. So you have these different traditions kind of they're all in the background of what's happening in early Christianity. And scholars draw especially the Maccabees tradition into early Christianity, which is actually an interesting idea in terms of the way early Christians thought about the breadth of Scripture and what all was included in Scripture. And the fact that I'm speaking as a Protestant, it's a question that Protestants need to ask. The early Christians thought about the Maccabees literature as Scripture. Well, that's interesting. What do we do with that? So it raises some of these questions. And there are ways in which some of the early martyrdom accounts have been. Scholars have shown they draw upon themes from the Maccabees. They draw upon themes from the Jesus story. The physical account of Paul, the earliest physical account of Paul that we have, some scholars have suggested is based upon the image of Socrates, the physical appearance of Socrates. So there definitely are things kind of in the water, in the cultural water, in the background of martyrdom. But it also takes on a life and an importance in the Christian tradition that really is not comparable to Greek and Roman or Jewish tradition. You have the Maccabees, but there's not that vast martyrological tradition in Judaism the way that it comes to be in Christianity.
When did modern scholars, start developing a framework to look at these martyrdom accounts through a more academic lens? Yeah,
it's really within the last century or so, even probably the last 30 years has taken a real turn. But beginning in the early 20th century, you have, I guess, a more, as you kind of say, more academic approach to these texts. Prior to that, what you had were collections of texts, but typically without a lot of historical rigor, I guess you could say. It was simply collecting the text, putting them into a kind of a compendium of text, and often taking them all at face value. And it's really been in the last 50 years, especially, that scholars have begun asking other kinds of questions. historical questions, yes, but also literary questions about the genre of martyrological texts and what kind of texts are they. So that's really been, especially in the last half century, the last 20 years has seen an explosion. And in terms of the field of New Testament studies and early Christianity, the study of martyrdom right now is one of the hottest fields out there. And there are books coming out all the time. It's kind of a trending field, which is unusual for me to be part of anything that's trending. Right now, martyrs are trending. So,
what are some of the literary and historical frameworks that scholars have developed to try and understand these accounts better?
Yeah, so it goes back to something you mentioned earlier about trying to get behind what the author's trying to do. What are the questions the author's trying to deal with here? And so this is where I want to draw some nuances with methodology. So I am not a person who thinks that all these texts were made up. That is a view that is out there. I think that view misses some of the evidence. However, I think it's also clear that many of these texts have been told in a certain way for their context. So what question are they trying to answer? Let's take, for example, an author like Stephanie Cobb, who's worked on martyrology, and she's written several books on this. One is she looks at the issue of gender. How are particularly female martyrs presented? And in some of these martyrdom texts, you have this play where, let's take Perpetua as an example, where Perpetua has this text where, according to tradition, it recounts things from her journal when she was in prison, and she has a series of visions. In one of these visions, she's in the arena, and she's facing this huge gladiator who we find out later is actually Satan, but she's stripped naked, and suddenly it says, "And I was a man." What does that mean? And this play between male and female it's a fascinating part of a lot of the martyrdom texts, particularly in a period of time when women, as far as we can tell, were not holding a lot of ecclesiastical leadership positions in the church. And there's some debates about some of that, I understand. By the second and third century, we don't have a lot of women that we know of as bishops or filling any of these roles. So now you have women playing important roles as martyrs who are models for other Christians. But in some of the texts, there's almost discomfort with that. And what does this text tell us about gender? She has another interesting book where she talks about painlessness and how many of the martyrdom texts talk about the martyrs not feeling pain, even though they're being roasted alive, they're put in the middle chair, they're being attacked by wild beasts, and they're not feeling any pain. And so for many scholars have just dismissed this as, well, these are just mythical accounts. And her approach has been, well, okay, but what are they trying to communicate? And her ultimate conclusion is what they're trying to communicate. These aren't stories about the martyrs. These are stories about God. These are stories about God breaking into human history and acting in supernatural ways. And that's what the authors are trying to talk about. They're talking about God. You have other scholars looking at the connection to churches, the control of churches. So Ambrose famously finds the bones of two martyrs that no one had ever heard of. He's in the midst of a debate with the Arians over control of the churches in Milan. He finds these remains of these two martyrs, puts them in a church, and suddenly Ambrose controls the church. He's actually buried between them. The bones of Ambrose lie between the bones of these two martyrs that no one had ever heard of. Well, so some people look at it from that perspective. How do the martyrdom stories affect ecclesiastical politics? So for me, I look at Peter and Paul, especially the role of the Roman church and the developing place of the Roman church in the Christian world. And how do the Peter and Paul stories help us track that and influence the way that those stories are retold? So there are a number of different lenses that people can take, which don't necessarily mean don't have to ask the question, is this true or is this not true? There can be something there, but recognizing that they're still literary texts and the authors still are trying to communicate things. And what can we understand about what they're trying to communicate, as opposed to saying true, not true, move along. It's almost never that simple.
And now a word from our sponsors.
When the world is just too much, turn it off and turn on positive, encouraging K-Love.
I'm gonna praise.
World off. K-Love on.
K-Love is sunshine for my soul.
I love K-Love.
Listen now on your radio, online, or on the free K-Love app.
K-Love makes me feel so good.
Positive, encouraging K-Love.
AI can help you write, research, and solve problems faster than ever before.
But there is a problem. Most AI is built on a worldview that does not reflect biblical truth. That's why Dominion Chat exists. Dominion brings the power of AI under the lordship of Christ. All the benefits of modern AI built on a biblical worldview foundation. Your work matters, but so does your soul. Sign up today at dominion.chat.
Yeah, it's so complicated. And I think we see analogies to this sort of thing in our everyday life. If there's somebody like Abraham Lincoln, people want to portray him 150 years later today in a certain light that reflects how they want those certain attributes of Abraham Lincoln on us today. Even though Abraham Lincoln was a historical figure and we have a great deal of information, his presentation is different throughout the ages.
Definitely. There's not far from my house, there has been a billboard up for some time, a big picture of Abraham Lincoln. And the quote is, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." That's a great quote, but Jesus said it first. Yeah. But here on this billboard, it's being credited to Abraham Lincoln. And I understand I think it's one of these, I forget the organization, but it's one of these, let's all be nice to civil to each other organizations. That's fine. But yeah, there you have Abraham Lincoln really mimicking the words of Jesus and being presented as if he's the source of that, this kind of idealized figure. And yet, as you say, there are people who come back and say, wait a minute, but what about this in Abraham Lincoln's life? What about that in Abraham Lincoln's life? I was just in San Antonio, and there's the Davy Crockett story and different traditions about him and the Alamo. And then another scholar claiming that he has evidence that he died in prison, in a Mexican prison. Well, no one in Texas wants to hear that. And so you have a kind of a debate and a dispute over the end of the life of one of America's great heroes. So there's always this debate for the legacy. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., another classic case. You see different people emphasizing different parts of his life, maybe not lying, but focusing on one thing versus another thing. Some people focusing a lot on his Christian background, some people explicitly trying to ignore his Christian background as they retell the story of Dr. King for reasons that are their own.
Yeah, but Davy Crockett did die at the Alamo. As a Texan, that's how it's. Are there some examples of from the early church of somebody who there's a historical account, but you can tell that they're being viewed through a certain lens?
What I work a lot on is Peter and Paul. So maybe I'll talk a little bit about the Peter and Paul stories as an example of this. So the earliest accounts we have of Peter and Paul are late 2nd century texts. We have the Acts of Peter and the Acts of Paul. And these are two separate texts, and each of them tells an individual martyrdom story. Paul dies and Peter dies, and there's nothing in the text that connects them except that in the Acts of Peter, the text tells us that Peter comes to Rome because Paul has left, and the church is being attacked by this guy named Simon Magus, or Simon the Sorcerer. Paul leaves, then Peter comes on the stage and eventually dies. Now, in these texts, the reason Peter dies is because he's preaching chastity. He's preaching sexual renunciation, and is causing some of the aristocratic women to come in here and preach, and they aren't interested in the bedroom anymore with their husbands. And so Peter is killed not because of the gospel, but because of the message of chastity, which is interesting because in the 2nd century in Christianity, we know there was a huge debate about this. What is the role of chastity in Christian experience and in Christian identity? Is chastity the highest form of faithfulness or not? So we know that was an issue in the 2nd century. Paul is killed in the text because he's accused of treason, basically. And he's accused of being someone who is going to undercut the empire by recruiting for a rival army. Well, we know that was a 2nd century issue. The apologists tell us there are all kinds of ideas out there about Christians that have to be corrected. So we see that. Now, by the 4th century, when these accounts, the individual accounts are retold, the story has changed a bit. And Peter's death is tied specifically to his showdown with Simon Magus, who becomes Nero's kind of pet sorcerer. And that comes front and center. By the 5th and 6th century, we end up with accounts where the two of them are together in Rome. And they died together in Rome, which, so for the Roman Church, that claims this joint apostolic founding, now you have a joint apostolic martyrdom story, where Nero comes front and center, and chastity basically falls away, and the treason account against Paul basically falls away, and you have a new story where they're a threat to the empire together. It's a much more kind of political threat to the empire than one about chastity, for example. And certainly by the time of the 5th century, we can see other ways in which the Roman Church was losing ground compared to other parts of the Christian world. And now you have this retelling the story in a way that reasserts in very clear ways the Roman founding of the church by Peter and Paul. They preached here together. They died here together. They're buried here. You should come here and venerate them. Therefore, the Roman Church's position needs to be greater in the Christian world than some of you think it does. And we are the only church founded by the joint apostles. So you have the development of the story over time retold in ways that emphasize kind of the questions of the moment. I don't think it has anything with the historical part. It's just, how are you framing it? I use this with students all the time. I say, I could ask you right now in class, what did you do between 6 o'clock Friday evening and noon on Sunday? And you could tell me things. If you told your mother, you may have a different list. If you're telling some of your friends, you may have a different list. All of them may be accurate. There may be truth in all of them, but you're going to present it differently based on who your audience is. And so part of what we need to do as scholars is, what are they including? What are they leaving out? What are they emphasizing in different kinds of ways? And we see that certainly with Peter and Paul, but also with a number of this collection of these kind of army saints or army martyrs, the military martyrs, who almost all have later texts written about particularly the 3rd century. So there's something about the 4th and 5th century where they want to show that even inside the Roman army, there were always converts to Christ who were standing up for the gospel, even at the cost of their lives. So there's really a lot going on in the thought world of early Christians that we have to try to unpack.
That seems to compare and contrast to certain things like the Simichian forgeries and the donation of Constantine that were written many years later. And it's pretty clear even in the style that they were written, that there's no way it was written in that time. How would you contrast that with the martyrdom account that's evolved over hundreds of years, that's really trying to make a certain point at that point in history about events that had happened in the distant past?
Yes. So with some of them, I think it's fairly easy. With Peter and Paul, and that's something I did in one of my book projects, it's fairly easy to track the perspectives over time. So we have the earlier material that we can go back to and look at and see, okay, we see the basic facts are the same. The way it's presented and the framing of it is different, but what do all the texts agree upon? They all agree upon certain facts. Now, there are some accounts, these later accounts written supposedly about earlier periods for which we have no other evidence. That gets trickier. Some of them have elements that make us suspicious. So if they sound almost exactly word for word like an earlier account with like the name changed, that's a slight exaggeration. But we have some that are like that. That seems a little suspicious. Ambrose, if no one's ever heard of this martyr before, and no one's written the account of these martyrs until after the bishop finds their bones, and now suddenly you need a martyrdom story, and so they write a martyrdom story, those are ones that we're going to look at with a little more suspicion. There are some scholars dismiss out of hand anything supernatural, and a lot of these martyrdom accounts do have supernatural elements. Now, as a person of faith, I don't automatically dismiss the supernatural, but some of them are strange supernatural things, like talking animals. And this shows up in a number of them. We have one of the accounts of Peter where he sends a dog to find Simon Magus, and the dog talks to Peter. It's a different, and we have talking animals in a lot of them. That's something that I look at and I think, is there if I can speak theologically, is there a biblical precedent for that? Well, maybe Balaam's donkey. But some elements of the martyrdom accounts and some of the supernatural elements seem to depart very widely, I would say, from any kind of biblical models. And when they diverge from biblical models, that's when I get a little more aware of those things, I guess. I recently had a debate with someone who wanted to tell me that the Acts of the Apostles and the Apocryphal Acts were the same kind of literature. And I think that's just not true at all. If you look at the Acts of the Apostles in the New Testament, you see the kinds of miracles that they're performing, the healings that they're performing. They're very much on the model of Jesus, as opposed to in some of the later Apocryphal Acts, they send a lion to kill someone. The lion lies down, starts talking to the martyr. They have a conversation, and then the lion attacks the people, attacks the soldiers. It's a very different kind of story than we see in the Bible. And those are the kinds of stories that certainly get my attention to ask, are we in narrative here? Are we in narrative fiction here? Where are we in this account?
How do you start to tease out those narrative elements, narrative, theological, and historical? Like one that comes to my mind is the Seven Sleepers of Ephesus, where they go into the cave. I think it was before Diocletian or right around a major persecution. They wake up years later. They tell, it's a great story. It's the Rip Van Winkle story. And they are even shocked with the different styles of dress and everything. If you see accounts like that are really a great narrative and they have a theological point, but the historical doesn't seem quite right, how do you start to tease those out?
Yeah, at some point, you sort of make a decision, right? And so there are stories that may have had theological value to the early church, but we may look at it and say, I don't know, is that really describing something historical? And I think about, well, a comparison might be the parables that Jesus tells. There was no guy who was going from Jerusalem down to Jericho and was beaten up by robbers, and a priest and a Levite and a Samaritan came by. That wasn't an actual story. Jesus tells us, like, it was a parable. It was a story about something that could happen, or could have happened, to make a theological point. And maybe some of these accounts, we need to read them like parables. They were never meant to be taken as historical events. They were meant to teach a spiritual truth, and that's still okay. Pastors tell stories all the time, and priests tell stories all the time that I know they get off the internet, none of which are true, right, but all of which prove some kind of spiritual point. And so with some of these accounts, I think we're clearly into those kinds of waters, versus other accounts where there are historical markers that do seem to put certain events in certain times and places, and they match well with other information we have about those times and places. Now, the cynical view is, well, they put those markers in there to make it seem like it was history. But I'm not convinced by that. It's, to be honest, Steve, part of it is you almost have to live with these texts for a while and to begin to get some of this. I think of the way, I was told at least, the way that the Canadian Mounties teach their people to detect fraudulent currency, counterfeit currency. What I've read is they don't do it by giving them all these different kinds of counterfeit currencies. They do it by giving them the real currency and letting them touch it and feel it and look at it over and over and over again. And then as you do that, when you see a counterfeit, you recognize it. I think that's part of the value in the study of Scripture. When you study Scripture over and over and over again, you begin to get a feel for what the truth is. And then when you see counterfeits, it's easier to recognize them. And I wish I had a more kind of concrete answer, but when I'm reading these, there are certain places where I get in a text and I think, okay, now I'm in a different space. And that for me is going to be in a different place than some of my other colleagues, for whom anything supernatural automatically means you're in a kind of fictional space. I don't necessarily believe that. In fact, I don't believe that. I don't believe that something supernatural is automatically fictional. But as I'm reading, there are certain points at which I see narrative themes that have shown up in a lot of other texts that at a certain point you begin to look at and think, okay, this seems like it's basically another text we already know about, rewritten with a new name, but it's basically the same text, the same kind of story, or seemingly not at all meant to be historical, but as you say, trying to tell a theological point. So I can't give you a really black and white concrete answer on that. And if I did, many of the scholars in my field would disagree with me on where those lines are. But it's important for me to be aware of them and not to deal in black and white as in truth fiction or fact or fiction. I don't think those are helpful when we come to the martyrdom stories. We miss too much that way.
How are these accounts being actually recorded? Were they being recorded in compendia? How early were they doing these sort of things? Oral tradition versus a textual tradition?
Yeah, so we have different examples. So let's take, for example, Polycarp, the martyrdom of Polycarp. So Polycarp was a bishop in Smyrna, so modern Izmir, western part of what is now Turkey. And according to the account, he dies in probably 155 or 160. Traditionally, this text has been seen as something written very soon after the death of Polycarp. In fact, the text indicates it's written very soon after Polycarp. Now, there's been some recent scholarship that has questioned that and tried to put parts of the text into the 3rd century or even later. And that's an ongoing debate between a few of us. But there are parts of the text that do very clearly set it in a certain time and do have historical markers that make sense for that time. That if you're writing 100 years later, it's easy to make certain kinds of mistakes that we see in some of these texts. Getting the wrong name of the leader, getting some dates wrong, getting some obvious historical markers wrong. We don't have those elements in this text. In the 3rd century, Cyprian of Carthage dies. One of the accounts of his death is written by one of his deacons, a person who actually knew Cyprian. This person was actually there when this happened. He wrote this text. And so we look at that text and think this is a pretty high degree of likelihood that it's true. Versus, say, someone like Ignatius of Antioch, who writes a series of letters on his way to Rome to die, talking about the fact that he's going to die. But his martyrdom story is not written until probably about 2 centuries later. So different kinds of cases. The closeness in time to the event, sometimes they are very close in time and sometimes they are very far apart.
Now, they talk about some of these scholars that you're talking about, they want to write off a lot of these things, especially with the amount of people who were martyred during the different persecutions. What do we know, really, statistically speaking, with a lot of these martyrdom events? Can we really put hard numbers on them? And if we can't, how can we try and define the severity of them? And where's probably the natural, always there's controversy in that.
Right. Yeah, there are some accounts that give us lists of names, but those are fairly rare. So a lot of times what we have would be, let's say, let's take the Roman historian Tacitus as an example. Tacitus writes around the end of the 1st century, and he talks about the persecution of Christians under the Emperor Nero. And Tacitus sets the context that Nero sets a fire that burns much of the city of Rome down. This fire happened in the year 64. We know the fire happened. And a lot of people were immediately suspicious because Nero wanted to build a new house, but there were people living where he wanted to build a house. Miraculously, and lucky for him, a fire breaks out and burns a large part of the city, including the place where he wanted to build a house. And so now the land is open. By the way, you can still go there. You can visit the house of Nero. It's called the Golden House. It's still in Rome. It's built on top of the ashes of houses burned in the year 64. Tacitus, the Roman historian, tells us that people were very suspicious. And so Nero, unlike modern politicians, ancient politicians sometimes tried to deflect guilt to other people.
You don't say.
Yeah, hard to believe, isn't it? And so he blamed the Christians. Why? Because Tacitus says, we already hate these people because of their superstition and their backward beliefs. So Tacitus does not like Christians at all. But he says Nero unfairly accuses them. So what did he do? He gathered some together, and upon questioning, which probably means torture, he got more names. And he cast the net more widely, and even more Christians are killed under Nero as scapegoats for the fire. Now, he does not give us numbers. Are these numbers in the dozens, in the hundreds, in the thousands? We don't know for sure. And that's where we have to be careful with how many Christians died. That's more what we typically get, a sense that there has been a persecution. Typically, as far as we can tell, most persecutions were sporadic. They may have been short-lived. They were regional. They weren't particularly well organized. So, how many died? We don't know for sure. But does the death of 5 or 10 or 50, how does that impact a community? How does that impact a sense of community remembrance of who you are? In later periods, by the late 3rd century, around the turn of the 4th century, with the Emperor Domitian, Diocletian, Domitian's the 1st century, Diocletian, end of the 3rd century, that is the first empire-wide persecution, as far as we can tell, called the Great Persecution. And we don't know for sure. Did thousands of Christians die? It's very possible that thousands of Christians died in that persecution. But we don't know for sure. We don't know what the numbers are. So often what scholars are reacting against is the idea that all Christians are persecuted everywhere all the time, which we all know that's not true. So in some ways, some of the reactions or the deconstruction approaches are reacting to an image that we all know is not true. But it sometimes swings to the example or to the argument that, well, all these things are fabricated. Christians really weren't persecuted. As one scholar has said it, Christians weren't persecuted, they were prosecuted. And so there was really never any persecution, but Christians created stories to make it seem that they were persecuted, and that became part of their sense of identity of what it meant to be Christian, but it was all a fake. And one scholar has gone on to say Christians are still doing that today. So modern Christians who claim persecution because the government passes certain policies, well, that's just more Christians making up the idea of being persecuted, just like the early Christians did. That's an argument that's been made in a kind of a well-known book.
And now a word from our sponsors.
When the world is just too much, turn it off and turn on positive, encouraging K-Love.
I'm gonna praise.
World
I praise the
off. K-Love on.
K-Love is sunshine for my soul.
I love K-Love.
Listen now on your radio, online, or on the free K-Love app.
K-Love makes me feel so good.
Positive, encouraging K-Love.
AI can help you write, research, and solve problems faster than ever before. But there is a problem. Most AI is built on a worldview that does not reflect biblical truth. That's why Dominion Chat exists. Dominion brings the power of AI under the lordship of Christ. All the benefits of modern AI built on a biblical worldview foundation. Your work matters, but so does your soul. Sign up today at dominion.chat.
I think that's an interesting point. Something like prosecution versus persecution. During the times of Diocletian, I mean, obviously the Romans took that very seriously. Your pinch, that was the be all and end all, taking that pinch of incense to assuage the gods. Is there any records from the Roman perspective saying that these guys are really going against our system here and we're doing the right thing in prosecuting them because they're not following these laws?
Yeah, so we have letters exchanged in the early 2nd century between a Roman emperor and a governor, regional governor in the region of the Black Sea. And even at this point, the regional governor writes and says, look, about this Christian problem, I'm not sure how to proceed, because and the problem there seems to be that because people are converting to Christianity, they're no longer going to the temples of the pagan gods. And the concern is, if you don't worship the pagan gods, they're going to get angry. And then they're going to punish the Roman Empire with disease and military defeats and those kinds of things. That's why Christians were often accused of being atheists. Obviously, Christians like, no, we believe in God. But from the Roman perspective, they didn't believe in the real gods. They didn't believe in the Roman gods. So the charge of atheism seems to be what's behind that. And the emperor, and they write back and forth. And finally, the emperor says, look, don't go hunting for Christians. But if you find out they're Christian, I guess kill them if you have to. But the Romans don't seem to be, for the most part, early on at least, looking for groups of people to kill until things go wrong. And then they really are beginning to look for scapegoats. So the middle of the 3rd century, you have Decian and Valerian, 2 Roman emperors who are trying to really push what I call in the book that old-time religion, traditional Roman religion. But there's famine, there's economic problems, there's war, there's massive invasions in the empire, and they think this is all going wrong. Whose fault is it? It must be these Christians. And so is that persecution or prosecution? Do the Christians actually break the law? I guess the only thing you could say is when Roman emperors say you must make a sacrifice or die, and Christians refuse, does that make that prosecution or is it still persecution? They really haven't broken the law. And as far as we can tell also from the text, a lot of these regional governors, they have no interest in taking the time to try to kill these Christians. They just want to check it off and move on. So that persecution, prosecution category, I don't think is actually that helpful because as far as we can tell, the Christians weren't actually breaking the law. And that's where prosecution, it goes back to 1 Peter, right? If you're going to be persecuted, don't be persecuted as a murderer. If you're breaking the law, you're not being persecuted, you're being prosecuted. And as far as we can tell from the early Christians, that's not the case.
Going back to the example you had given about the fire of Rome, that seems to be one of those examples where you start to get a triangulation of evidence. You have archaeological, you have Roman sources, you have Christian sources. Are there some other examples of that where there's a lot of evidence that starts adding up from a lot of different sources to say that, yeah, this is accurate and you can build out from there?
Yeah, so let me talk about the Nero example for just a few more minutes. Let me build that out a little bit more because we do have Tacitus, the Roman historian, again, no friend of Christians. There's another Roman historian named Suetonius, also no friend of Christians. He tells us something similar. And what's fascinating about Tacitus' story is he talks about that they're being persecuted for the name Christian and how the name comes from their leader who was crucified under one of our regional governors. And there's a certain cluster of ideas, which actually sound a lot like First Peter, because the passages in First Peter chapter 4, where he talks about if you suffer for the name Christian, then expect this. And he refers to it as a fiery ordeal. Do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal. Some translations take that out, but that's what the Greek says, fiery ordeal. Tacitus tells us that they're being persecuted because of the name Christian. So you have two elements, name and Christian. First Peter also says fiery ordeal. Tacitus tells us that one of Nero's favorite ways to punish the Christians was to burn them alive for nightly illumination in the gardens of the city. So there are three elements there that are in First Peter, the name, Christian, and fire, that are also in Tacitus. And depending on how one dates First Peter, those are pretty strong connections with specific things, not just general things, but specific things that seem to match up very well. You add in Suetonius as a third category there. That gives me a lot more confidence. But there are scholars who begin with Nero and say, no, Nero didn't really persecute Christians. Tacitus he wasn't really talking about that. And that to me requires an awful lot of juggling and ignoring the evidence that's there to try to disprove the idea that Christians are persecuted.
It seems, or I've heard arguments that some texts have been massaged by later medieval copyists to include Christian, or Josephus comes to mind, that it's been claimed that later scribes have added in certain things. Is there a way that you can look at a text and say, well, no, that's definitely didn't happen, or well, maybe that did happen?
Yeah, Josephus is famous for the passage about Jesus that many scholars think, well, he wouldn't have written this. And there are really kind of two reasons for that. One is some scholars don't want it to be there, just honestly. But that's when you look at style. Is there a break in the style of the account that may suggest some different voice has inserted itself here? Those are the kinds of things you really want to look for to see what the later insertions might be. Versus other accounts that we have medieval manuscripts, we have parts of earlier manuscripts, and we can trace, has something been added here? And in some cases, yeah, we can see certain things have been added as the cult of the saints and the veneration of the martyrs expanded. We can see that there are 15th century things happening that were not there in the 4th century. We can see some of those elements definitely there in some of the texts.
Maybe what are some takeaways that modern people can get from these either Christian, non-Christian, religious, a-religious, from these martyrdom texts to maybe understand how literature is done, how different activities are recorded? What could we take away from that?
Yeah, I think I always take students back to the words of Jesus. If they persecuted me, they're going to persecute you. So one of the first observations I try to make with students is, if you are Christian and persecution breaks out, the reaction should not be surprise, because Jesus said this is going to happen. And I do think in these texts what we have is a series of the accounts of the fact that it actually has happened, and it happens in different ways in different contexts. And with the martyrdom stories, there are the opportunities and there are the dangers with these accounts. The opportunity is that when something happens that's real persecution, it's keeping in mind, I guess, kind of like Hebrews 12:1, the great cloud of witnesses, that if you are being persecuted for your faith as a Christian, then people like Perpetua and Polycarp and Cyprian and Peter and Paul, those who have died for their faith, they're in your cloud of witnesses, and you are walking the path that they have walked. And so don't be surprised. Jesus said it, don't be surprised, because that's the path that some of us are called to walk in terms of discipleship. The other side of it is we have to be careful, I think, not to label things persecution that are not persecution. And this is where I get a little concerned for some of my Christian brothers and sisters who seem to be looking to identify any little thing as persecution. And over time, it's almost like the boy who cried wolf. We begin to lose credibility. The fact that I'm not allowed to do this at work, or I had this up in my office and they told me to take this picture down, or look, they scheduled this tennis tournament on Sunday instead of Saturday. Those kinds of things that can sometimes be interpreted as persecution. I think we need to be careful about that, because it's not like other places in the world where they actually really still are killing Christians. So it's the two elements of that. It is, yes, we can be encouraged with their example, But we have to be careful about that.
As a scholar in your position, if there was a document that could just be dug up tomorrow, what would be something that you would just love to really get in your hands?
Yes. We know that the church historian Eusebius of Caesarea, famous for his ecclesiastical history and some other texts he wrote, we know that there was another text he wrote that had to do with martyrdom that we don't have. And I would love to find that text. And and it's a strange thing to say. This is what a weird scholar like me does. Sometimes I lie in bed at night fantasizing about like going to some monastery somewhere and talking to a monk and have him say, let me show you this one little thing we've got back here, and then finding it. That'd be sort of like for me, kind of a holy grail sort of situation. We know that there were other sources out there, and because they're mentioned in text, we have a reference to one of Origen of Alexandria's commentaries in which he talks about Peter and Paul. We don't have the commentary. I'd love to find that commentary. I'd love to see what is it that he has to say about those accounts. So there are a couple of things out there, but probably Eusebius, even though Eusebius definitely spins things a lot, particularly in a kind of pro-Constantine direction, but he has these martyrdom accounts, and I would love to get a hold of that, because who knows what other martyrdom stories were out there that we don't even know of at this point. So if I can just mention one thing to you, this book, I'll show you here. This is a book called Christian Persecution in Antiquity by a German author named Wolfram Kinzig, Kinzig, and just translated into English by Marcus Bachmehl, who's a very well-known New Testament scholar in the UK. I just picked this up last week at a conference. It's brand new, hot off the press from Baylor University Press. And if you're interested in this period, this might be a good place to start. To be honest, I'm about 2/3 of the way through the book. I haven't finished it yet, but I have a good sense of what it is. This is a book that takes a kind of broad historical overview, talks about some of the famous martyrdom stories, but this is not a highly technical book at all. There are endnotes in it, but the endnotes are almost all to scriptural references. So it's written for a general audience. If you're interested in the topic, this might be a good place to start. And in some very succinct and very understandable 140 or so pages, you would get a pretty good overview of the early periods of persecution and what some of the issues are. So that may be something that the listeners may want to consider.
Oh, that's a great. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm sure people will be interested in that. There seems to be a lot of good stuff coming out of Baylor.
The University Press there has done, they're doing some really good work, and the landscape of scholarly publishing is shifting. And I won't go into this too much, except that people are realizing, a lot of scholars are realizing, it's nice that people can buy our books. If we write books that people can understand and get them with publishers that are accessible and affordable, that's a good thing. So that's why I went with Baker Academic Press. It's more affordable, it's more accessible, and Baylor University Press is a very good university press, but they're putting out some high quality books. So the traditional academic publishers are still out there. They're still doing well, but I have a book from another publisher that's $140.
Yeah.
And the latest book is $22 on Amazon or whatever. So it's there's a certain value in being able to get the work out there more broadly.
Yeah, it does seem that there's a lot of publishers that are democratizing, that you don't have to, a book that most people could read if they were interested in it, but they're not going to pay $70.
Yes, absolutely. Definitely. Yes.
Well, awesome. Thank you very much. We definitely have to do this again. If there's something you think of or you're interested in, or you write a new book, just let me know.
Okay. Thank you. Yes. Well, I'm happy to do this. And like I said, I think about this stuff all the time. And there are, through the podcast, if people have other questions, you would know how to put them in touch with me. It's a vast array of study right now. And I'll say it is a battleground. And some of the most destructive voices are coming from some surprising places in the church. And that's something for us all to be aware of, that there's a theological debate and there's a historical debate, and sometimes the two are mixed. And I try to keep my feet in both worlds, but it's an interesting time. And that the textbooks that are written in 20 or 30 years could be telling a very different story about early Christianity, depending on how this goes. A different story that I think is less historically accurate, that does write some of the martyrs out of early Christianity, and retell the story of Christianity in a very different kind of way.
When the world is just too much, Turn it off and turn on positive, encouraging K-Love.
I'm gonna praise.
World
I
off.
praise the man.
K-Love on.
K-Love is sunshine for my soul.
I love K-Love.
Listen now on your radio, online, or on the free K-Love app.
K-Love makes me feel so good.
Positive, encouraging K-Love.
AI can help you write, research, and solve problems faster than ever before. But there is a problem. Most AI is built on a worldview that does not reflect biblical truth. That's why Dominion Chat exists. Dominion brings the power of AI under the lordship of Christ. All the benefits of modern AI built on a biblical worldview foundation. Your work matters, but so does your soul. Sign up today at dominion.chat.